Okay, so now we're going to delve into specifics. We're going to talk about specific countries, destinations, and so on. Again, it's impossible to boil the ocean. Asia Pacific is a big region. We're not going to cover every area, but we'll talk about some bigger, more prominent issues and considerations for the countries identified. Now, remembering Asia Pacific, specific to this presentation, is within the areas confined within the red circle, and that is as north as Mongolia, as far across as Pakistan, down to Australia, New Zealand, inclusive of Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Philippines, and Indonesia. It's also one of the fastest growing tourism markets. As I said, not all of it is external travel, that is from Europe, Americas, Australia and so on. It's internal, so significant increase in the ability for Chinese travellers, for Indian travellers and so on, notwithstanding the annual human migrations that take place within the Asia Pacific market. So you've got a significant volume outbound when it comes to the Hajj every year, particularly from countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, making the pilgrimage to Mecca and so on every year. It's getting bigger and bigger, and then not to mention the Golden Week, or the return to the ancestral heritage, ancestral origins in China, where hundreds of millions of people travel in the space of 1 or 2 weeks. So it's the same as the entire population of the US, of North America, up and moving in the space of a week. It's an incredible process. So again, that's inclusive of these human migratory aspects, which is increasing, but it's also putting greater demands or burdens on the system when you couple human migration with an increase in interest, or an increase in middle-class Chinese travelling to the rest of Asia Pacific, and middle-class Indian travellers as well. So let's look at some of the more prominent countries or the more specific issues. And as we sort of go through them, again, without prioritisation or vagueness, we'll touch on a few points. So China in particular, China still has issues with visas. Applying for and getting visas and different nationalities, it is improving, but it's still not 100%, and it's still not as accommodating or as open as people would like. And so therefore, even the preparation process of travelling to China becomes problematic. Limitations, significant improvements in infrastructure, brand new airports, brand new road infrastructures, and a whole host of other things, which was proudly put on display during the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, because their ability to assimilate and create all of these new facilities. But getting around the country is still difficult because the burden on domestic carriers, the airports, particularly as you get away from the international airports in Beijing and Shanghai, commuting between smaller cities, going to visit certain areas, the understanding of English, and certainly the safety standards of whether it comes to food, water, transport, and a whole host of other things is increasingly problematic for people travelling to China if they get there in the first place, or just finding somewhere to go. There are still countless attractions in China that are yet to be discovered by an English-speaking audience because they're just not advertised or available or communicated in that sense in the first place. India, on a scale, is actually far worse to get a visa in many aspects for some travellers. And dealing with the Indian embassies abroad, many people will tell you, and from my own experience as well, it can be an up and down process, depending on how you've gone about it, where you are, citizenships, and a whole bunch of other things. Again, it can be prohibitive, despite the promotion and tourism and the attraction to go there in the first place. Standards of safety and security vary immensely across the country. Female travellers have been preyed upon. There have been this is both local and tourists as well, female safety issues after dark, or just generally getting around the country, certainly travelling by oneself. The standard of food and water, consistencies of sanitation and hygiene causes a lot of medical and health issues for a lot of travellers. And the way the airlines or the service industries work. they're in the transport industry, or they're there to make a profit. They're not there to accommodate suggestions or support in some instances, and it can be outright rude or belligerent at times. But again, you can't base an entire industry on a couple of isolated experiences. However, those experiences do dominate both the communications and the decision makers of organisations. And safety issues when it comes to road safety in particular, when it comes to personal safety, when it comes to physical assaults, or even travelling into some areas where there are ethnic clashes or there are physical violence. As I said before, the police standard of policing in India is simply not as evolved or superior as many other parts of the world, and it is purely in numbers in uniform. And this goes for many parts of the airports as well, with dedicated aviation or security apparatus. Again, they've got outdated weapons and sticks and things, and they really are not a service culture. Getting access to an airport, you don't get into the airport unless you have your printed itinerary and passport ready, so you can be standing out on the street in the rain, far away from the airport, before you even get in there, because they're limiting the access to the airport to passengers only. And if you've used electronic means or didn't print it or can't find it in your bag, you can often experience quite a lot of unpleasant journey delays because you simply weren't prepared, because it was an outdated process. Even getting through airport security can be problematic, if nothing else. Japan is an increasing attraction for more and more foreign visitors, which again, given a highly populous country and location, they've had some significant issues with nuclear reactors and tsunamis and earthquakes and so on. But the experience, some people are simply not prepared, whereas the locals are for things like earthquakes and so on. Being someone who travels there and not familiar with it can be very disorientating or fearful. The infrastructure is improving in terms of navigation for tourists, and there's countless technology options available in the country that can offset or provide constant communications to help people feel more at home and connected with wherever they are, or simply find their way around the country. So it's a very evolved and advanced market, and Japan's very similar to Indonesia and Hong Kong in the sense of the infrastructure and the capacity and first world nature of the facilities, from airports to hotels to fast trains and a whole bunch of other things. It's as you get further afield, it can be a bit more problematic, or more of a challenge, or greater preparation is required. The Philippines is trying to modernise. The Philippines has a very unique aspect that many times when you're travelling in and out of the country, you're also travelling with millions of Filipinos, who is still one of their greatest exports. So they're coming in and out for visa purposes or immigration or returning from abroad, and a whole host of... So the airports are typically overburdened. Many parts of the airports are just simply outdated and inefficient and very 10, 20, 30 years ago by comparison to first world or modern airports. A lot of paperwork, and again, hotels vary between brand new to outdated facilities. Traffic is appalling in locations such as Manila, for example. If it's raining on a Friday night in Manila, it can be hours for the commute between the airport to the city and vice versa. Again, something underappreciated by a lot of travellers. It's also a significant destination of choice for a lot of US ex-servicemen, for example, travelling. So that's sort of brought a European Western sort of influence in some of the locations, or availability to some of the key areas where there have been previously military bases or military servicemen retire. But in general, getting around the country is not as problematic, but again, it causes safety concerns. And certainly as you travel down south, and there have been a number of more popular and reported incidents of kidnappings and terrorist attacks and violent physical crimes. Guns are an issue in the Philippines, and the use and physical violence associated remains an issue. Now, these are some of the headline negative aspects, but equally it has some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, some of the most fantastic scenery and accommodating nationals. I'm not highlighting or underlining purely the negative aspects, but certainly the factors and consideration for individuals planning or undertaking tourist activities and travels to these locations. And look, in Australia, and I've mentioned a number of times, from an Australian who has lived abroad for many, many years, coming back to Australia, it still has not caught up with the rest of the world, and certainly large parts of Asia Pacific. A lot of the hotels are outdated, the airports are lack of infrastructure and high costs, currency variations between all of the Asiatic currencies listed here, and the Australian dollar and the US dollar and so on, causes a fluctuation in the interest and desirability for Australia as a destination in the first place. But when it comes to things like infrastructure, road safety, road infrastructure and so on, it's better than many other aspects, but it's also very limiting, because 85% of the population in Australia still lives within 30 kilometres of the beach or the shoreline, and there are still large parts of Australia that are unpopulated or inaccessible because that's not where the population simply resides. So therefore, people wanting to have a bush desert type experience may find themselves having less and less support, or more and more difficult to go out. One thing for tourist consideration, which is a high point of danger, is that the commute between Australian destinations can often be both timely and long in distance, and because of the types of roads, unfortunately tourists and visitors can find themselves meeting misadventure or having accidents because they're simply not used to driving for 2, 3 or 4 hours to get from one destination to another. They've followed a GPS, and the GPS is electronically taking them in the wrong direction, or they're not prepared for the types of road conditions, or things like kangaroos and other wildlife that can jump onto the Australian roads and cause significant damage, up to including death of the occupants of a vehicle. So again, people are not prepared for it, or they simply don't understand those aspects of when travelling to Australia. Or, as I've highlighted several times, is when they come from a country or location and they've travelled in China and Singapore and Hong Kong, they come to Australia and find that there is no train from the airport in Melbourne to the city, or it's poor in Sydney but it's better in Brisbane, and it doesn't even work in Perth. Those sorts of things can be quite both an experience and polarising and upsetting for many travellers. Vietnam itself had a very, very big growth a few years ago because of the business sector investing in Vietnam. It is still very much controlled by the state, but there was a boom in tourist infrastructure starting to be developed. That hasn't maintained its enthusiasm or growth or trajectory in recent years. It's fallen off. And as a result, some of the initiatives that were started have simply either not come to fruition, or they're simply not as evolved. Getting around the country, motor vehicle safety, road safety issues are still quite prevalent. Access to healthcare, and also commuting around the city has become, or not around the city, but around the country is also of concern once you get to the country, as well as the ability for English and English comprehension. But it is a growing destination. Some people are choosing it because they've visited these other locations, so they're going as this their second and third choice and so on. But again, it's underdeveloped in many aspects, and not necessarily as on par with many aspects of Asia Pacific or other countries by comparison. So when we start to now look at some of the other countries, Hong Kong, there's been a stark awareness that as Hong Kong has transitioned to one country, two systems, that is, Hong Kong is part of China. There is a growing Chinese influence, and this can be seen often in taxi drivers now that don't necessarily speak English or know where they're going because of an increase in mainland Chinese drivers now. An experience more akin to Beijing and Shanghai, whereas you didn't get that a few years ago. Hong Kong is still a very modern economic sort of city, but again, it's getting a lot of pressures placed upon its tourism industry and the update of because it's a small place. So if you want to modernise a hotel, you've either got to close the hotel or do it in pieces. So some of the hotels are getting a little old and outdated. The infrastructure is limited, or even getting on the train, for example. So the train from the airport, as I said, is a dedicated resource, but then once you want to travel around in the underground subway, you could find yourself during peak hour or commuting with workers and so on, and again, it's a massive crush of people if that's not what you're familiar with. Or on weekends or after work, again, it can go from what seems like a relatively desolate sort of shopping centre to all of a sudden thousands or millions of people descending on it because it's before and after work, or it's a Sunday, or it's the day the maids have off, and those sorts of things affecting it as well. But again, it's a very simple and consumable destination. It's very highly sought for both travel and culinary options. A lot of people love the food travelling to Hong Kong, both European as well as Asian cuisines available, and it's very popular for that reason, as well as hiking. You know, some people will travel to Hong Kong and they can be from the city and into the mountains and prepare for hiking and trekking within a matter of a few hours. It's very unique in that aspect. Or it can be a gateway to travel through to the southern aspects of China, into the new territories where, again, shopping and opportunities are abound for those who are capable or know that the opportunity is there in the first place. Many of these destinations too are also becoming medical tourism hubs. That is, people travelling to these locations for medical procedures. South Korea as well falls into that category. India is being used by some insurance companies because of the quality and training and experience of Indian nationals, or even NRIs, non-resident Indians, that is, Indian ethnic Indians who have travelled abroad and have got green cards or worked abroad and then come back to the country to work, or they're almost reverse expats. You also see some of that a lot of it happening in Singapore and Hong Kong as well, where people will go for medical procedures or medical treatments, cosmetic surgery and so on. Thailand is also a very, very popular destination for that. People travelling to get their teeth done, or augmentations, or certain procedures that would be cost prohibitive, cheaper in those locations, but still done by first world or internationally renowned medical professionals. South Korea, for many, has had a significant American influence, so it's got a lot of more familiar aspects that people coming from the Americas have, in terms of roads and consumerism and a whole bunch of other things, but problematic when it comes to getting out of the major hubs when it comes to language, not quite as prevalent when it comes to English, or the fact that you can get there by both ferry as well as aircraft as well. The other thing too is the antics of North Korea weigh heavily upon every South Korean. National service is undertaken by all the males, and it can seem a bit militaristic at times for some travellers if they're aware of it, or the concerns of North Korea firing missiles and military exercises can be a little concerning or very new for some individuals. But again, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of modernisation, in terms of access to resources and quality of standards, South Korea, like Singapore, Hong Kong and so on, Japan are up there with international cities and economies and so on. Indonesia is thousands of islands. So people's opinion of one destination versus another is very very subjective, because the infrastructure has simply not evolved across the country, and tourists are very much concentrated in a few small areas, whether it be Batam, those coming from Singapore across to an island, or Bintang, going to Bali, or those who are going to Jakarta or Bandung. You tend not to find people going as far afield, or they're not permitted to, either because of visa on arrival issues, or control by the government, registering of foreigners. The infrastructure is simply not there. Now, Jakarta, in the last 10 years or so, has gone trying to do a massive modernisation, remembering that the city itself is still divergence as to whether it will remain the capital and should it move to Bandung and so on, is that flooding and mosquito-borne viruses and road conditions and pollution and all those sorts of things are factors associated with capital in Jakarta. But Indonesia is a very, very welcoming and accommodating place for many people. But again, what they read and hear anti-sentiments towards whether it be Muslims or whether it be Indonesia or religious conflicts that have taken place tends to dominate people's decision making, and therefore it's very, very limited in terms of where tourists are being attracted to. But the other thing that Indonesia is well known for, and certainly very popular for when it comes to tourism, is surfing. There are still many aspects of surfing culture and lifestyles available in Indonesia, with waves and conditions and beaches second to none in the world, and international surfing competition being held in those locations, which takes a very small unknown village and puts it on the international landscape very, very quickly. But the infrastructure, the condition of food, the local standards, the economy, commuting to and from, the road safety in particular is a point of concern, and public transport is just simply just not accessible for or just not used by tourists or foreigners, because it's simply not there, or it's simply not available. And the standard of healthcare and all those sorts of things are also significant factors which the government is in trying to address, but it's a long time before it will be comparable, or Bali becomes a standard for other parts of the country. Not that should be the benchmark, and certainly many people would not want it to go that particular way. So again, religious diversions, things that have taken place, and the threat of terrorism and previous terrorist attacks that are well known that have targeted foreigners and so on, remains an issue throughout the country, as well as their own active groups and criminal elements, or people just being driven by the fact that there is no welfare and there's a necessity to survive. So again, Indonesia is not unique. There's very shades of that in India and the Philippines and so on as well, but in Thailand. However, it very much dominates the tourism space, and not to mention corruption. People can experience corruption at their arrivals at the airport, and passenger processing by government authorities or the police or the military. Those sorts of things again often leave a bad taste in people's mouths, or leave a negative effect that they share amongst their friends and social media. Singapore is a hub and a nexus, a clearing point for a lot of people who fly or commute to other locations. Advanced systems of care. Again, the overburdening of the country, or being seen as just being too expensive by comparison, has really started to take a toll in some parts of Singapore. Shopping malls everywhere, but it's kind of shades of the same depending on where you go from certain perspectives. But it's a centre of medical excellence where people go for certain procedures, although it's had increased competition and diversity in some of these other locations, or it's simply a short stop for individuals and or for those seeking the opportunity to do gambling and go to the casino and those sorts of things. However, a large majority or a big percentage of tourists to Singapore simply transit through Changi, Singapore's airport, because they're en route to somewhere else. And even if they've only got a few hours, some people then go into the city or go shopping or do certain activities, or then travel up to the Malaysian archipelago, all those sorts of things. So Singapore has its issues and has its nuances. Access to the cost of primary care, emergency care, people's ability to basic first aid, if it's raining, if it's a Friday night, catching a taxi, if there's a Formula One. Again, these little things that when they take place on a compressed economy and environment such as Singapore can have a significant effect. And hotel occupancy rates can be as high as 90 to 95% all year round. So if there's an influx or a change in something, then finding accommodation can be all but impossible for individuals or groups or spontaneous travellers as well. Malaysia again. There's a number of ethnic diversity issues as it evolves. There's inconsistencies between the capital KL and other parts of the country, and certainly an inequality being felt with elections and political influences, typically not understood nor digested by tourists, but it's evident in the way that some things have evolved in certain areas and other things haven't, or the priority to certain destinations above others. But it's becoming a popular destination for a lot of Arabic travellers because of the base culture or base religion of Islam in many parts of the country. And its ethnic mix between Chinese, Indian, Malay, and Asiatic. So it's very much a melting pot and seen as that, as is Singapore to a degree. So therefore it's become very popular as a sort of a multicultural environment, but again, whether the economy has the exchange rate at the time, the economic factors that influence the development in certain areas, the pollution at times, Indonesia, parts of Indonesia when burning off, and this also affects Singapore as well, burning off and massive smoke. Hong Kong suffered from a lot of smog pollution from China as a result of the factories. So all of those sorts of things can influence travellers or be seen as positive or negative factors, but certainly contribute to the safety elements when it comes to... and Malaysia's had an increase in things like violent crimes and agitators and its own threats. So again, it's a point of concern, not to mention road safety issues in many parts of the country as well. And lastly, Thailand, just briefly touching on Thailand. Everybody's aware of things like the airport closure and the red shirts and yellow shirts and a series of rumours of coups and a whole bunch of other things. At the end of the day, much of that is inconsequential to the current state of Thailand, unless you go further south where there is insurrection or a mini war that's been taking place for decades. It's for many people, it's about the beaches, it's about the shopping, it's about the lawlessness associated at times with travelling in and around Thailand, and that's the attraction for a lot of Europeans, Arab nations, and Americans and Asiatic, is that there's a sense of freedom and lack of control at times, but with that comes an increase in issues, whether it be ferry-related, maritime collisions, whether it be poisonings, whether it be school leavers travelling to some of these locations and having overdoses from recreational substances or alcohol. Road safety in particular, massive concern, not just limited to the capital, but anywhere that's driving through duration throughout Thailand. The use of seat belts and a whole host of other things which I've repeatedly mentioned. And at times, an inability or lack of English outside key areas. That Malaysia, Bangkok in particular might be accommodating Phuket and English and so on, but as you start to get further diverse areas, you are required, or there is a requirement for basic language skills. So they're sorts of the key issues that, and as you can see, each location has its own recipe, its own formula, its own issues or shades of the same that help tourists make decisions or help the tourism industry regulated to a degree, but they should be understood and they should be factored and they should be addressed for individuals and groups alike, whereas unfortunately more often than not they're glossed over because of the cost of travel or the opportunity and the adventure, or just the commercial drive to get more customers. Some of these things get suppressed or they're not spoken about or they're simply not divulged, or people don't experience them until firsthand negative things occur and they go, well, I didn't expect that in a country like Singapore, Philippines, India, or whatever, because they didn't do the research, or they simply didn't have the depth of understanding and knowledge associated with that country. And this comes back to the sentiment or the ignorance which I spoke about earlier. So, just by comparison, we've done some analysis, and we've done some research and things over the years, but a couple of things I want to touch on here is, let's start to sort of qualify this on the very, very worst end of the scale, and that is where people have unfortunately passed or been killed abroad whilst travelling. So as we look at some of the non-natural factors for US citizens in particular, we can see that the highest concentration of deaths for US citizens over a couple of year periods is Mexico and Haiti, because of the proximity to the US. But then we start to see the Philippines, Thailand, India and China start to creep into those statistics, in Japan. Asia Pacific is not without its incidents that lead to certain mortalities or the death of tourists, but these numbers are often either used or these facts are used as a scare factor or glossed over by travellers. The fact of the matter is that some of these locations, you've got a much, much higher chance of meeting misadventure, suffering an illness or injury, or even being killed as a result. But as we start to look at those numbers, we can see vast differences. So overall, based on those numbers, Mexico constituted 7%. But then as we go down to Thailand, is Philippines and Thailand, we're talking 2 and 2%. So it's still a small percentage, and without any unnecessary disrespect to those that have been affected or lost their lives, but we're still talking Philippines 60, Thailand 60 as well. More people die on the roads in capital cities in the US on a weekly or monthly basis. It's a fact of the matter. So in isolation, these numbers can be concerning, or the countries can look like, oh my God, look at where these these Americans. But as you can see, 23, number 16 on the list is Australia. 23 Americans, less than nearly 1% of Americans die in Australia. So it's often taken out of context as to which countries and which events have caused these particular contributing factors. But if you then measure that against heart disease, cancer, motor vehicle accidents, deaths and murders in your own country, you'll find that these numbers are still very, very small by comparison. So if we look at the actual causes of death, and this is the more interesting factor. So homicide is a big factor, but when we look at Mexico and Haiti, it's possibly not surprising in some of those aspects. But motor vehicle accidents, suicide, drowning, drug or air accident. These sorts of things, tourists are often starkly unaware of. Particularly when it comes to things like suicide and drowning. Travel, as equally as uplifting and exhilarating as it can be a very, very depressing or stressing event for some people. Or they've undertaken travel with the intent to take their own lives, or a whole host of other things that people need to be cognizant of. And drowning, and I'll use Australia as an example. Australian beaches are often patrolled and have lifeguards and so on, but they're not for the faint-hearted, and they're not easy. Bondi Beach in Sydney in Australia is a classic. There's television shows on showing every day and every week tourists getting themselves into trouble on a highly populated beach right next to the city. So if you extrapolate that out to the more remote cities and the more remote beaches, not to mention pools and drunken behaviour around spas and those sorts of things can often lead to people's demise as well. So again, education and awareness is paramount, and not suppressing and hiding these things, but just checking in and making sure that people are prepared, or having some sort of provision to make them aware of things like, well, drowning, it is a factor in some locations, and suicide and motor vehicle accidents in particular. There's certainly a disregard or blaseness, and I've spoken about it multiple times, about arriving in a country and there are no seat belts and there are no road safety elements, and you can clearly see that road control factors and the rule of law are not the same as where you're from. You shouldn't just surrender yourself to and go, that's just the way it is, because that may be the last decision that you make in your life. So again, when we look at the volumes and the breakdowns of numbers, homicides and suicides, 22% of homicides, 17% motor vehicle accidents. And then as we start to go down to terrorism, which dominates the headlines. Now, you'll notice that I deliberately not go into too much detail or segment terrorism as a separate topic in any of this, because it is a very, very small, low factor. Despite all the popularity, despite all of the carry on, the media and the headlines and everything else, terrorism as a cause of death and injury for travellers all across the Asia Pacific is a very, very, very small component. So let's do some comparison. What about Australians? Now this is the main reason we've done this is because of some of our target demographics and available data. So Australian deaths abroad, for example, from 2006 to 2011. So we can see the numbers that have been going up, but they haven't gone up staggeringly. We haven't seen an increase from 2006 to 2011, an increase of hundreds. It's still been a limited number of Australians abroad. Now the top countries, not surprising because of Australia's proximity to Asia. We've got Thailand and Vietnam and so on, but Greece pops out for a lot of people like, oh, well, why is that? Well, in parts of Australia, particularly in Melbourne, there's a high immigrant population, and Melbourne was touted there at one stage as having the second highest population of Greeks outside of Athens. It is a high population of Greeks that then travel abroad, typically, to Greece, and have accidents or because they're elderly and so on. So Greece kind of stands out there. But you'll see there that the USA is a significant feature in deaths of Australians abroad. Then you'll see you've got Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Hong Kong, China, India and so on. So you've got a high concentration of Asia Pacific countries. Not surprising because of the cost and proximity to the region, both for work and leisure, that those countries feature. Now, those countries feature more often than not because of accidental deaths, because of injuries and illnesses and so on, as opposed to the cause of death being things like murder and so on. Now, having a look here, as you can see, the primary cause of death for Australians, for example, in 2011, illness, natural causes, other and accidental. Now, unknown, that's laziness on behalf of the local embassy and consulate, is that they categorise unknown because they either didn't know or, well, I say laziness, and I'm not apportioning just towards the Australian, but in some cases there is no autopsy, there is no investigation. We genuinely don't know what resulted in the death of the citizen. And that's also a contributing factor. In some of these locations, there are still secrets and suppressed information or things that are glossed over or just outright corruption. So as a result, 23% of Australians died because someone was too lazy to tick the right box, or there was no autopsy, or there was no investigation, or the circumstances are so grey that unknown is the best category to put them in. So illness and natural causes, as you can see, are still the two biggest killers, so to speak, of tourists abroad, not things like terrorism and kidnapping and murder and all those other things that are at the extreme end of people's consideration or preservation when it comes to actual travel. So we did some work with insurance providers and we started to look at some of the insurance policies. Now, this is primarily out of the Australian market, first and foremost. And we started to look at, well, what else? Aside from death, what are the other contributing factors? So the top 5 insurance claims out of Australia from this particular group of analytics that we looked at was medical claims, lost or stolen cash, lost baggage, cancelled flights and travel delays. So again, we're not talking exotic things like kidnapping and terrorist attacks and a whole bunch of other things. They are routine administrative considerations based on a user base of 8.2 million travellers in this sample space here in 2012. So if looking at comparison between 2012 and 2014, and these were the sort of comparative analytics that we looked at, in terms of the increase, we saw a significant increase, or actually a decrease in some comparative elements as well, between medical and luggage and cancellations, others, and rental vehicles as well. Every location doesn't provide rental vehicles, and we would certainly advise against having rental vehicles in many of these locations because of the road safety factors and vehicle standards. But you can see, in the middle section on the claims, for example, 2012 there were 1,200 cancellation claims, 2013 857, 2014 56. Now that's in part of an improvement in the aviation industry, or an improvement in access to alternate choices or management by those airlines. But at times, sometimes too, it's the policies have been changed in terms of what you can or can't claim. So these are not 100% accurate, because the policy changes may have been taking place over a couple of years to reduce or mitigate the insurance providers' risk rather than the travellers themselves. So for Australians in particular, Asia still represents a big chunk of claims. However, the European and the US markets tends to where people make most of their claims abroad as well.